Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back. It's another episode of the Karma Koala podcast. And this week I'm at the University of Maastricht and I'm talking to Dr Hofmann because he has just published a book called The Regulation of Cannabis in Europe, Highs and Lows. And it's now the second proper book on cannabis that I've spoken to with a legal slant in the last sort of 4 or 5 weeks, which is great to hear. Hopefully there's more coming. Anybody who listened to the previous podcast about the Elgar publication on cannabis and IP, I'm sure will be interested in this conversation. Robin, welcome to the Karma Koala podcast. In the preamble, we had a little chat about, what brought you to cannabis, what brought you to writing a book.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Sean, first of all, for having me in your podcast. What brought me to write this book? Well, first of all, the experience. I'm from Germany originally. I work in the Netherlands since 2018 at the university. I'm a lawyer by training, specialized in EU criminal law. I do a bit of criminology as well. And I, from the very beginning, when in 2021 in Germany, it was announced that cannabis should be legalized. It's called it the total legalization of cannabis, which I find was a very German word, but I think it kind of describes what they had in mind, and also this great idea, this grand idea of fully legalizing it. And that was the time I actually got involved with cannabis more specifically. Beforehand, I was more focused on organized crime, on drug crimes, on drug policy. But that caught my interest. And it caught my interest because, well, from the very beginning, we teach here in the Netherlands, which is notoriously famous, I would say, for the cannabis policy. And we teach a lot about cannabis here because international students are very interested in it. So I kind of commented in the German debate on it. And from the very beginning, I have to say, I was skeptical, not of if the idea was a good idea. I thought from the beginning, well, it's an interesting idea. As a researcher on drug policy, I found it very intriguing. A big experiment in the middle of Europe, the biggest country in Europe, to legalizing cannabis. I found that very intriguing, but I was very skeptical when it became to the EU regulations, and when it was at looking at the legal framework and the possibilities and the wiggle room actually that exists within the European Union, I was skeptical that this plan will actually be realistic. And I voiced my concerns, and I kind of had a big platform, so major news outlets asked me about it. And these experiences, then I thought, well, over the past years, how it then all turned out. We all know that the legalization was significantly watered down in Germany. And I thought, well, this is so interesting. This is so much to learn from the mistakes, especially Germany made. Not only mistakes, they also had some good ideas and some good approaches to it. But I thought, well, I'm not writing it up, and if I'm not writing it up in English, this will all be lost. So that was is a long story to.
No, well, that's exactly right. I mean, look, it's exactly my. If you don't write it up and provide the sources and all that sort of stuff, it will just be lost to time. And the way that the information supply through the internet is being managed these days, that does worry me. And then there's a lot of people who come in who have no knowledge at all and will make the same mistakes again. And that's the issue. So, I mean, it's really interesting because, people perceive Germany as the center of the EU along with France. yet both nations are having real problems understanding how to create a regulated environment for medical and then adult use cannabis through Brussels. If they can't, what's the solution going to be? Because it's very, if we look at what's happened with Italy over the past few weeks, and they're backtracking on their light hemp, and then really nothing much in terms of change in Spain and Portugal. Whispers out of the Czech Republic and Slovakia of things happening, but I hear the same story every 6 or 7 months, and then it all goes silent again. There's lots of little sort of tiddly things happening around, but the center almost is just choosing to ignore that. And maybe if it closes its eyes long enough, it'll all just go away.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It makes kind of Germany as this big player within the EU, it makes it such an intriguing case in a way, because you would anticipate that they, have the resources and they have a strong voice within the EU and they have the power to go through with such a project. Yet they didn't really. They were not very successful. When I look now at the EU, it's very kind of fragmented. All these different policies. I would say a better role model is probably Portugal. Huh? It's always kind of framed as one of the most progressive policies when it comes to cannabis, and I would agree. Nevertheless, I think they achieved some interesting and some progressive successes in Germany as well. When you think, I was always really baffled by this idea of this social clubs, the Anbauvereinigungen, as they call it. So there's this long history of cannabis social clubs in Europe. It goes back to the middle of the 90s, I think, which was always kind of this idea of having a social club, of having, like-minded people that would grow their cannabis and share and have the social idea of it. And the Germans, what they did, again, a very German thing, they kind of subtracted the social out of it, because they said, well, social, we don't need that. That is just, that's just a cherry on it. We just make these associations where you grow together, if you can grow at home, if we allow that, and EU law provides for that, we can do that, then why not, put it in the hand of a professional and to, like-minded people into a club. But of course, with this let's say with this rule that you cannot smoke it together. We don't have a social part in that.
But it's a bit like that rule which you see in a lot of places around the world. You can grow cannabis, but you can't buy seeds.
Yes,
it's the classic, catch-22.
Right.
They love to create, within regulation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of this. I mean, if you look at the drug policy, you find these paradoxical things everywhere. Huh? And when you look at it from the outside, you just think, well, how does that make sense? Huh? In Germany, we had for a long time this rule that you can inhale, huh? You can smoke cannabis because you kind of destroy it. So you don't possess it in the moment you smoke it. But if you have it in your pocket, then you are in possession of cannabis, and that, makes you a criminal. So it's a strange thing. But either way, I always found this idea of these associations a good one. Now, when you can see after 1 year of legalization, I call it, just for the simplicity of it, legalization technically is a partial decriminalization. But after 1 year, there's still not really many of them, and it takes a lot of time. But that's also a reoccurring pattern. Huh? Everything that is kind of progressive in drug policies, it just seems to take a lot of time. It's the same with these associations. So until now, there's not a single one operating, but hopefully within the next month, we will see the first ones, and let's see how that plays out.
And what about the structure of the book for, lawyers who are listening to this? Because most of my readers and listeners are lawyers, so they'll be interested in some of the detail. How have you structured the book to explain what's happened in the EU or what hasn't happened in the EU? Probably more better way to put it.
It's very straightforward. It's a very classical structure. I kind of look at it, go through it chronologically. I start with what was the initial year. I look a bit into the debate in Germany because that again is I feel like a pretty unique thing in Germany when you look at the legal debate is all in German. It's not really German legal scholars are not very interested in having this international impact.
No, well, I
So
noticed because I tried to follow it from the outside, and my German is zero, so I'm using Google Translate, and it's hard enough reading English, legal thought and theory, but diving into German or French legal thought and theory left me with a headache most days.
yes, well, I feel the same, and I do claim to understand German as well. It is a unique thing with the German legal scholars, and especially when it comes to criminal law. The scientific side of it is very, very German centered, and it's a pity because they have some very good scholars, they have some very good ideas, they have some very good approaches. And I always feel they should have a bit more, of an international impact. They should publish more in English, but they don't. And I felt like, well, if they don't do it, I based in Maastricht, based in the Netherlands, it has we have a very international footprint here, if you want, especially when it comes to law. And I always felt, well, let's publish in English. Let's try to translate and explain some of these ideas, these legal ideas. And that's kind of the structure of the book. I try to explain what the thought process was. Why did they really think? And I'm still baffled by this question. Why did they really think they could easily legalize cannabis and do it, not just like that, but in compliance with international law, in compliance with European law? That was kind of the underlying question, and I go through it and through the legal debate, and I try to summarize it, try to comment on it, try to analyze it, also see the weaknesses of this debate. There were a bit at the end of the day, and that is then the kind of the conclusion of the book, the concluding chapter. They were a bit over the heads, I would say, and this is typical for German criminal law. In a way that it feels very, let's say, superior to European criminal law and to European regulations. I think that was the main mistake they did, and that kind of cost them this legalization, this total legalization, that they underestimated the power European law has and European regulations has, and that at the end. That's kind of without telling too much or giving too much away.
If I jump in, is the answer really to start from undoing various European laws in order to be able to process more regulated compounds or substances? Because we've got psychedelics on the way, and it's going to be natural in 20 years' time that people are going to have to talk about the coca leaf, the way that criminal law is affected in Europe by transnational cocaine trade. So at some point, somebody's going to have the common sense thought, oh, we're going to have to change the way we do things. Do you think that you first have to undo Vienna and Brussels and then do these things? Or do you just present them as one by one particular set of compounds? So, the conversation in the US is a bit more sophisticated because we're talking about cannabis, hemp for human consumption, industrial hemp, and a load of subsets within those subsets. And the states actually in the US are, they might have reactive thoughts, but they're actually quite sophisticated in their approach to managing it compared to the rest of the planet. Do you think that Brussels understands that at all, or cares even?
Well, I mean, that's the quintessential question in a way. The US are in the advantageous position that they don't have EU regulations over them. And also, I got to say, they have a bit of a, let's say, a flexibility when it comes to international law.
I think it's laissez-faire.
Yes, that's a more positive term for it. But at the end of the day, both does not really apply to Germany and to most European countries. So this, what the Germans call the Völkerrechtsfreundlichkeit, or this, compliance with international law, is kind of a state doctrine. So this is really important to Germans and to most in Europe. And then when you think of EU regulations, it's also a practical question. This EU Commission, they are really good at suing states. If you don't comply with EU regulations, you get dragged in front of the European Court of Justice, and they will sue you, and you end up paying a lot of money if you lose, taxpayers' money. So that's kind of the practical question. But I think quintessential about this question is that what makes this whole topic so interesting about it. That's where it comes together, politics and the law, or policies and the law. And to give a short answer to your question, I think you cannot achieve cannabis legalization in any European country without having the EU Commission on board. And I know that many people feel like alienated by that, because they say, well, they will never change in Brussels. And but that's not really true. There are ways that Brussels has changed their policies over the years, especially with the help of the European Court of Justice, that tend to be quite progressive, at least in some areas. So I think if you really want to implement change when it comes to cannabis within Europe, you have to go through the European Union.
Now, a quick question. Do you cover that dreaded nation just over the water to the north, called the United Kingdom, and their approach to cannabis, which is basically give it to all the friends of the Tory party and let them make lots of money, and let the Albanians also make lots of money, but ignore reality? Otherwise, did you look at the UK at all? In my view, it's a basket case when it comes to cannabis. It's done all the worst possible things, but I'd just be interested in your opinion.
Yeah, so I mentioned it at some points, but I just feel like the UK policy is not that interesting, because it's really not very good, to be honest. There's not much to learn from it. I specifically chose the regulation, the title, Regulation of Cannabis in Europe, because I look at Switzerland specifically, and that is not part of the EU. But I think there's much more to learn from Switzerland than it is from the UK, to be honest. So it doesn't have an own chapter or an own part, but it is mentioned a couple of times, but mostly as a bad example.
And the other area I'm sort of interested in is the Scandinavian countries always present themselves as quite liberal, but actually they're really not liberal on cannabis at all, are they?
Absolutely not. No, Sweden is a good example for an absolute zero tolerance policy. It's interesting. It's an interesting case you're mentioning here, because it's indeed they promote themselves even as being very liberal, as very similar to the Netherlands. But when it comes to drug policies, they are on different planets. You got to say that. It has to do, I think there are cultural reasons for that. In Sweden especially, maybe you can go even back to, but I don't want to go too deep into that, religious reasonings, that you have this strong Protestant culture.
I was about to say the Protestant culture. Well, that's the northern parts of the UK as well, where of course some of the worst drug use occurs, and the worst health outcomes are in those sorts of places, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. So so that's kind of Sweden. I always like as an example, but always to illustrate the policies of the Netherlands. But then again, there is not much to learn from it in a way. They're not very successful with their drug policies. Drug consumption is as high as in all other European countries. They have a growing problem with cocaine. They have a growing problem with organized crime. So in that sense, I try to have a bit of a more positive focus in a way to look at countries. Okay, who's doing something differently, and what can we learn from it? And that's the underlying question of the book. Huh?
Well, Robin, we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to say Robin Hofmann, the author of The Regulation of Cannabis in Europe, Highs and Lows. So who's the publisher again?
That's Routledge.
It is Routledge. Do check it out. It's out now. Wildies in London always have these sorts of